Well, hello everyone, and welcome to SDP Connect. My name is Christiana Morales. I am the director of the Self-Determination Program here at Disability Voices United. One second, I need to fix my view because I am like way too big. Um, I want to remind everybody that we have interpretation in both Spanish and Korean. So please go to the bottom of your screen and select the globe and select your language. Even if you speak English, make sure to select English because if a question is interpreted, you won't hear it. If you're on a cell phone, go to the bottom of the cell phone and there are three dots and click those three dots and that will take you to the interpretation languages. So welcome, we have a great presentation today, but first we have an announcement by our president, Judy Mark, and here is Judy.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you all. I know that we spoke uh, recently about the bill that Disability Voices United is co-sponsoring about to improve the self-determination program and to break down the barriers. It's called Senate Bill 1281, and it is having its very first hearing on Monday, April 1st, this coming Monday. You will have a chance to watch it live. You cannot actually make any comments through Zoom or by phone. The only time you can support it nowadays, as if the pandemic is actually completely over, is to show up in person in Sacramento. So if you live in the area, the hearing is on Monday at 3 p.m. in Sacramento. If you are on our mailing list, you will get lots of information about exactly where it will be and the room number. So we really hope that you'll watch it and support it. And we are very, very confident it will pass out of this Senate Human Services Committee on Monday. And then we're going to have, it will become harder as we go on. So so hoping that you'll tune in, and we're very excited about the potential of this bill. That's all. Thanks.
And so our next connect is going to be about the master plan. And so it's literally our next connect is the same day as the first meeting of the master plan. So the people that are in it from our organization are going to come and talk about like literally hot off the presses what went on at the meeting. If you're not familiar what the master plan is, Judy, can you explain what the master plan is?
Absolutely. So the master plan is being conducted by the agency called Health and Human Services Agency, which is above DDS, above the Department of Developmental Services. So if you want sort of a hierarchy, you have IHSS and you have the regional centers here. And then you have the departments that actually fund them and are supposed to be providing a lot of oversight of them. And that would be for the regional centers, the Department of Developmental Services. For IHSS, it's the Department of Social Services, which is just another, like a sister department to DDS. And then above that is the Health and Human Services Agency. They're the kind of big kahunas. They are conducting what they're calling a master plan for developmental services. They did this in the past few years for the aging community. It was called the Master Plan on Aging. And what they did is they stepped back and they looked at the systems that are supposed to be supporting people in the aging community, people who are older adults, and said, are these systems working? Are there improvements? Is there enough housing? All those kinds of issues. And it was a very productive process, which set a lot of long-term goals. They are going to start that process on April 10th is the first meeting of the Master Plan on Developmental Services. And we're hoping that there's going to be full participation from the communities. The people who are in charge of it from the Department of Health and Human Services will be traveling around the state. And I think that Christiana has put information about it in the chat so that you can see that there's initially this event on, it's a hybrid event on April 10th. It's both in person in Sacramento and on probably on Zoom. They haven't sent out a link yet for it. The next meeting is I can't remember. I think it's like April 20 something. Maybe somebody can find that for me. And that is going to be a completely virtual meeting. And then the next meeting will be in Los Angeles. So for those of you in the Southern California area, you'll be able to go to a meeting in person on May 15th. So this process is critical. They need to hear from you, who are people with disabilities and family members, on whether the system is working and your suggestions for how to improve the system. That's the regional center system and how it interacts with IHSS, with school districts, all those other agencies that are impacting our lives. And it is really important for everyone here to be involved in that process. And we will continue to keep you informed. And in fact, at the next SDP Connect, we'll tell you how that April 10th first meeting went, but hopefully all of you will be watching as it's happening.
And we have some people from our organization who are on this master plan committee, and it's Judy Mark, Tim Jin, and Elena Tiffany. So we have 3 people from DVU who will be there speaking. So we know that self-determination is going to be an important discussion there, because we're going to make sure that it's in that mix. So we're ready for our presentation. I'm so excited to introduce to you. Lisa Concoff-Kronbeck, who is the public benefits specialist from Undivided. And today we're going to talk about, I consider a big rule change for in-home support services. And so she's going to talk about that. And then afterwards, we can have a Q&A and we can talk a little bit about how those services might impact us in the self-determination program. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much.
Are-
Am I ready to go?
You are ready to
All
go.
right, sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my presentation. But before I do that, I'm going to share a link in the chat. And this is a link to the actual all-county letter. You do not need to follow along with this link right now, because I'm going to kind of highlight some of the sections of it in my presentation. But I want you to have this and bookmark it, and I'll explain why. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. One second. All right. Okay. So I'm just trying to actually get back to the presentation now that my screen is shared. Sorry. Can you all see my screen?
We see your screen, but it's not in presentation mode.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to get out of the Zoom window and it's not letting me for some reason. All right, let's stop sharing. Let's get rid of Zoom. Like it worked a second ago. Okay.
We love Zoom.
Yes, right?
We all love Zoom. You would think after all these years, we would be so good at it, but it always trips us up.
Yeah, it keeps defaulting back to Zoom even when I try to get out of it. All right, let me close this. Ah, perfect.
We can see it perfectly.
Okay,
Lisa.
you can see it now. I can see it now. We're good to go. I need to be able to see the presentation too. Okay, so we're talking about All County Letter 23106, and what we need to know about it. So the reason that I gave you the link in the chat is that I want to preface this presentation by saying that I don't know what kind of training the IHSS case workers are getting on this, because I am still hearing that people are being asked to provide their work schedules and to confirm whether or not they're working full time. And I think that not everybody is aware of this, and I've been told that some people have been told, "Oh, we're not doing this yet because we haven't figured out how to implement it." So you should hang on to this so that if you have a home visit, and just to clarify, this is for minor children, for children under 18 and under 18, that you either print out a copy of this or have a reference to it written down so that if your caseworker is insisting that you cannot be paid as the provider or that you cannot hire an outside provider, you can refer them to this all county letter in case they haven't received training on this rule change. So I just want to start with that. So All County Letter 23106 is the implementation of AB 120, which eliminates provider eligibility requirements for minor recipients. So basically what happens is that they're creating parity between children who are receiving IHSS and adults who are receiving IHSS. This went into effect in late February because it went into effect 60 days after the All County Letter was published. And a little bit of background about why these changes were enacted. So previously, a parent could only be paid as the IHSS provider if they were prevented from working full-time by their child's extraordinary needs, and there was no other available caregiver with a legal obligation to care for the child. And in most cases, that meant that the second parent had to be unavailable due to work, full-time work, or full-time school, or disability. And you could only hire an outside provider if you have whether you had one parent or two parents in the home, you could only hire a third party provider in situations when the parent was unavailable for due to those reasons. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on that because it no longer matters. Those rules have been lifted. So what was happening though is that some children who were awarded IHSS hours were not able to use their IHSS hours and have a provider get paid because either the parent was ineligible to be an IHSS, because the parent was ineligible to be an IHSS provider because of their immigration status, or because they had a conviction history that prevented them from serving as an IHSS provider. But at the same time, they were considered available to provide care because they have a legal obligation to care for their child. And so because there was an available parent, they could not hire an outside provider, but because the parent was not eligible to be the provider, that essentially meant that nobody could be the provider. So these children who were awarded IHSS hours were not able to access them in many cases. So as I mentioned, AB 120 aimed to remove these inequities by creating parity between children and adults when it comes to choosing your IHSS provider. So now they have the same options for choosing a care provider. So we're going to just look really quickly at what the actual changes in the code look like. So for Welfare and Institutions Code, section 12300, section E, this is what it used to look like. And it talked about when the provider is a person who already has a legal obligation to care for the child, it limits that person's ability to be paid for the services to only when they've left full-time employment or prevented from getting full-time employment because no other suitable provider, and it lists the specific areas where they could be paid. So this is what it looks like now. Basically, all of these services are still the same. There's a limit to what kind of services you can get, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But now this is applying to all providers to minor children and not just parent providers. So if we're going to just look at the manual of policies and procedures really quickly. I'm not going to go through each of these because again, they no longer matter. But if you have ever looked up the MPP for these sections, this is what it looked like. And it listed all the specific, listed basically the regulations for how this was implemented. This is no longer the case. So this is when the parent has left full-time employment, preventing from, and all of this is gone. And the examples of both parents being employed full-time, and one is employed full-time and the other is part-time, but just didn't leave full-time, but it's all gone. So what I really want to talk about is what has not changed. So just to get past this section, IHSS is funded by several different programs depending on how a person's enrolled in Medi-Cal. So in some cases, so most children who are, and I'm gonna, this is the text of the letter, but I'm gonna like spell out exactly what it means. Most children who are enrolled on the HTB SDD waiver or the self-determination waiver are funded through the community first choice option. And the state gets additional federal funds for participants in this program. But in some cases, some children had to switch over to the personal care services program. So that basically the personal care services program is another funding source for IHSS, but it bans parent providers. And so in some cases, a child could request to be switched to the PCSP program so that their parent would no longer be considered available so that they could hire a third-party provider. So under that program, if you are enrolled in PCSP, you still cannot hire a parent to provide for a minor child. So basically the state is just asking for that when children have switched from PCSP in order to be able to not hire a parent, that they switch back to CFCO so that they can have access to that increased federal funding again. So this is where I think there may be some questions. So these services will remain the same, and these are just excerpts from the letter. So if a service was not available to be compensated under IHSS before this change, it will not be available now. And so this is another excerpt, and this is kind of all speaking to the same thing, which is that they're still going to assess the child based on measuring them against the care that a parent would be expected to provide to a typically developing child of the same age. So the hours that a child receives are not going to change based on this. The hours follow the child. The hours don't belong to the parent. So the question of who can be the provider is totally separate from what hours the child can actually get awarded. So you may recognize this functional skills index ranking for minor children. I can just explain it a little bit just so that it's a little bit familiar to you if you haven't seen it before. This is the index that shows where they're willing to authorize hours for IHSS. If you see a 1 for an adult, that typically means the person can act independently and provide that task for themselves. For a child, it means that the parent is usually expected to provide that service to a typically developing child of the same age. So where you see 1 or 6, that means either it's a 1 or it's a paramedical service, which you can get IHSS hours for. And if it's a 1 to 5 or 1, 5 or 6, then it depends on how much assistance the child needs. So that's when they're ranking based on the level of assistance. So because children will continue to be assessed in the same way, that means that even if you hire a third-party provider, they're only going to be paid for services that IHSS has authorized. So if you have, and this will be relevant when we talk about some of the issues that might come up with the regional center. So if you have, for example, a 4-year-old child and they can't bathe or brush teeth independently and they need assistance for that, children are not, if you go back to this chart, if you look at bathing and oral hygiene, that doesn't come in with IHSS until they're 8 years old. So IHSS will consider that the parent is still meeting the child's bathing and oral hygiene needs until the child turns 8 and is eligible for IHSS hours to be authorized in that category. All of the rules for provider enrollment remain the same. So you still have to be eligible to work in the US. You still have to provide ID. You still have to go to orientation and do the enrollment agreement and do the live scan for the criminal background check. None of that has changed. So if you were not eligible to be an IHSS provider because of your immigration or conviction history, you still cannot be an IHSS provider now. The difference is that now there are no restrictions on hiring a third-party provider to come in and provide those hours so that your child gets the care and support that they need. There are some questions about the overtime rules and exemptions. the rules and restrictions and requirements to overtime and exemptions have not changed. So exemption 2 is the one that most people are going to be applying for. And that requires that you either the child's disability is so significant that that IHSS has to be provided by someone who lives in the home, or you live in a rural area and you've not been able to find another provider, or you've not been able to find a provider who speaks the same language as the child. So in those cases, when you have more than one child in the home who have IHSS, you may have more hours than a person is authorized to work by themselves. And so this exemption allows a person to work, instead of 66 hours a week, they could work up to 90 hours a week. The question is, now that the other parent is not considered unavailable, is IHSS going to want the other parent to provide those hours instead of the parent who has the exemption? And the answer is we don't know. This will come up again with questions about the regional center, but I mean, ultimately, just because a parent is no longer prohibited by statute from providing IHSS hours, that does not mean that they are able to, especially if they're working full time, especially because we know that, full time employment does not always mean 40 hours a week, especially if you're not paid on an hourly basis. The other parent might still be unavailable to provide those hours. Especially if you're talking about, 25 or 30 extra hours a week, that might not be within the parent's capacity. So we'll return to that discussion when we talk about the regional center. Okay, so what does all of this mean for the regional center services? And this is whether you're on the traditional funding model or SDP. We don't know. Wait and see. File appeals if necessary. We can kind of try to guess what the regional center might start saying once these changes are being consistently implemented. But I haven't seen these issues come up yet, but that doesn't mean that they haven't, and it doesn't mean that they won't. So I kind of wanted to try to anticipate what things the regional center might say, and so that we can think of responses to those things. So I have a couple of them here. One of the concerns is that the regional centers might try to consider IHSS a generic resource for respite, now that there's no restriction on hiring a third-party provider. So they might say, well, and they've tried to do this in the past, sometimes with protective supervision. But basically, these are the reasons why these are the ways you might want to respond if they try to say that. Number one is that parent providers provide more hours of care to their child outside the scope of what's typically expected for a typically developing child, far more hours than IHSS funds, and parents still need a break from that. Parents providing max hours are in most cases still not going to be able to work full time, which means that IHSS is their primary source of income. And this means that if the regional center is saying, well, you take some of your IHSS hours and just use them for respite, they're basically just telling parents to pay for it out of pocket. And that's not, I mean, there's a reason why the regional center funds respite. So if you're saying just use some of your hours and hire someone else, that's functionally saying take some of these hours that you're being paid for, even though there's all these other hours you're working that you aren't being paid for, and basically just pay for it out of pocket. So that would be my response to this. As far as them trying to consider it a generic resource for specialized supervision, IHSS is not routine childcare. It specifically says, especially protective supervision, where they have tried to shift this over for respite, it specifically says that protective supervision is not available for routine childcare. And providers are not going to be paid for services that aren't authorized. So if you have a child who requires a lot of physical assistance with things, but IHSS has not authorized those hours, you're not going to have enough hours to use as specialized supervision. So specialized supervision is childcare that is explicitly the opposite of what IHSS is. And here we have the question of whether the regional center is going to be able to say, well, you can get your respite when the other parent is around, and they can provide the respite instead, and that resolves the issue of losing household income. First of all, the parent who works full time most likely is already participating in the child's care to some degree, and so shifting hours around doesn't actually change who needs a break and who's providing care. It just changes who's being paid for it. The other issue is that shifting hours to a non-provider parent may result in a net loss anyway, because if the other parent takes some of the hours, then the parent who's providing most of the hours loses some of the overtime. And that also becomes an issue if people have questions about, well, now that I can assign both parents to be providers, do I want to assign both parents to be providers? And I would say that if one parent is working full time and is not the one who's really providing the IHSS hours, and the other parent is the one who's providing the IHSS hours, then I would say keep it that way. I mean, that's just my personal recommendation. But part of the issue is that if you assign another IHSS provider, IHSS is gonna hound you to assign specific hours. They'll want you to explicitly assign the first provider X number of hours and the second provider X number of hours, and each provider can only bill that number of hours and no more. So it doesn't allow you a whole lot of flexibility. So if one parent is going out of town and you need the other parent to be able to provide the hours, definitely like sign them up. But just on a regular basis, if you know that one parent is going to be providing all of the hours, just keep it that way, because otherwise IHSS is going to want you to assign hours. But as far as the regional center, yeah, it's still going to result in a loss of income, because having the other parent do the hours on top of, they might be exhausted after coming home from work and they still need to do other things in their lives like sleep and eat and spend time with their children that doesn't involve caregiving outside the scope of what's expected for a typically developing child. Um, Even if all of that doesn't apply, that's still going to result in a loss of funds. And ultimately, the bottom line is that this change was made to give more freedom to IHSS recipients and their families to hire the care provider of their choice. And as with self-determination, the whole point is to give the person who requires the care more freedom of choosing a provider. And any efforts by the regional center to dictate and decide who ought to be the provider is a subversion of the law's purpose. Because if the point is to give the consumer more choice, then the regional center should not be the one making that decision. It should be the consumer and their family. So that is my presentation. I am totally happy. I want to tell you a little bit more about the company that I work with is Undivided. We I mean, you can see we kind of combine expertise in technology and community to support parents of kids with disabilities. Most of the people at Undivided are parents of kids with disabilities. Um, it's a digital platform where you can organize all of your documents, like your IEP and your IPP, evaluations, assessments. And we also have one-on-one parent coaching. We have office hours and Facebook Lives, and the opportunity to work with individual experts in insurance, education, and public benefits. We have articles, we have presentations by experts outside of Undivided. And I really encourage you to check it out. And that is my presentation. I would love to take questions. I'm going to uh, stop the screen share just so that it's not taking up extra bandwidth. But I just want to preface the question and answer period by saying that the answer to some of your questions may well be, I don't know, let's wait and see, let's find out. If there's an issue, like reach out to advocates or file a hearing request. We don't know how some of this is going to play out. And, all we can do is try to anticipate it and be ready with some of these arguments. But the first thing, again, just to bring it full circle, the first thing I would definitely encourage you to do is keep this all county letter bookmarked, because the IHSS case workers do not all know about these changes, and they will continue to try to implement the rules until they know otherwise.
Lisa, that was amazing. Thank you. So I learned so much in this. How we do question and answer is we alternate back and forth between raised hands and questions in the chat. So, lots of questions have been coming in the chat. So we promise everyone that we're going to get to those questions. So let me start with Gracie, you have your hand up.
Yes. So my question is, in regards to full-time employment. So, before I used to work full-time, so my worker told me that I wouldn't qualify for IHSS. So I had to, leave my job because my child comes first. So now I'm confused because now I'm hearing that I can work full-time and be my son's full provider.
Okay, I just want to give you a minute to finish your question. I don't want to interrupt you. Is that the whole question?
Oh, no. Additionally, I would like to add, because I have direct supervision as well.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if that could be a factor as well. And that's the reason why my worker told me what she told me.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that the caseworker should never be telling anybody that their child doesn't qualify for IHSS just because the parent can't be the provider. Those are two totally separate issues. The child's hours are completely independent of who is going to be the provider. And a parent who works full time could always hire a third party provider to provide services while they're at work. So I hope that caseworkers are not still telling parents that the child just doesn't qualify if they can't be the provider. The source of confusion is that the rules changed. This is very, very new. And so this is really like barely a month old. The rules have been completely different for years. And now, starting in late February, the rules have completely changed. So if your caseworker told you that recently, it may be that they don't know about the rule change, but I'm guessing that they probably told you, it was probably the truth when they told it to you, and it's changed. So the question of whether a parent is allowed to work full time and also be the provider is a totally separate question from whether the parent is able to work full time and also be the provider. And what helps with the new rules is that it's not an either or. You don't have to choose between having an outside provider and providing the services yourself. With protective supervision, you have to be able to show that they have you fill out a 24-hour care plan, and you need to show how your child always has adult eyes on them. But it does not always have to be you. So one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight is that, yes, you can be the provider, but no, you cannot work at the same time that you're providing services. So if you're working from home, that does not mean that you are simultaneously billing hours to your employer and billing hours to IHSS. So in many cases, you will still have to hire an outside provider because you're not home all the time if you're at work. But you can have an outside provider while your child is while you're at work, and then when you come home, you still have to supervise them for the whole night, because a lot of our kids, it's not, you don't just tuck them into bed and then go to bed and see you in the morning, right? Like there are things that you do the whole night. And previously, parents who worked full time could not bill for those hours, even though they were above and beyond what a typically developing child would require in terms of care. The other difference is that when you get home from work, you could still have your provider stay for a couple hours while you settle in. Because before, you couldn't have an outside provider come in while any other parent was available. And now you can have a provider there while you're, spending some time with all of your children, and someone is there to help you with the extra things that you need so that you don't have to worry about it in that moment. So the issue is that the rules changed. So now you can decide if you want to go back to work part-time, if you want to go back to work full-time, you can still claim the hours while you're home, but you may still need to have an outside provider when you're not home, especially with protective supervision. So I hope that answers the question.
That was a great question, Gracie. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you so much. Can I ask another part also? Um, it's about the during the process of the application, they tell you that they're gonna reimburse those hours. So how long does it take? How many pay periods does it take?
Oh, I mean, that is a big giant. It depends. Generally speaking, the retroactive hours, they go back to the date that you applied. And in some cases, if the parent was providing the hours, you can request that they go 90 days before the date applied. But generally speaking, it's going to be the day that you applied. But that could be months. It's not going to be weeks, I'll tell you that much. Like, you're not going to have a paycheck 30 to 60 days later. It does take several months. And so I would not apply for IHSS with the thought that you're going to have hours reimbursed, next month or even the month after. It does take several months. But that could just be a few months, or that could be 10 months, or that could be a year if you have to appeal and go to a hearing. It really depends, but it's not a fast process.
Thank you, Gracie, so much.
Okay,
So
thank you so much.
I want to kind of go over with our community. Why are we talking about the IHSS hours, and how does that relate to the self-determination program really quickly? And how do we think this is going to impact? We don't know exactly for sure. Lisa and I kind of were brainstorming and talking about this. What we do know is that IHSS is a generic resource, so it has to be used first. And what we did is we had families who had IHSS hours, but were not able to access them. They weren't able to use them. And so when the regional center was creating their budget for their self-determination program, they would consider those hours covered. So if you created a weekly plan and you had IHSS, they would say, oh, those hours are covered. Now, but they weren't, because you couldn't use them. So that's why it caused a problem for self-determination program people. So this has the potential to be a good thing. It can also be not a good thing, because people who could not access IHS hours before now can, and they may consider that when they're determining your budget with self-determination program. So remember, this is just for minors. This is not for adults. And we had a question in Spanish from Evelyn Rodriguez. And she asked, before we had the restriction that if the parents worked one full-time and the other part-time, only the part-time parent could be the provider for all the hours. Now are they saying that both parents can share those IHSS hours? I'm asking this in the specific case of families where the parents share custody of the child.
Okay, so in families where, yes, the short answer is yes, but again, this is a situation where it depends. Because previously, when those restrictions were in place, it all comes down to what kind of arrangement you have in your custody agreement. Because if the child lives in two separate homes, then typically if both parents want to be the providers, then those hours would be allocated in terms of where the child, first of all, the hours would be assessed in terms of where the child spends most of their time. But the other parent could request some of those hours while the child is with them. Some parents, in some situations where one parent worked, the other parent still provided the IHSS hours, even though the child was staying with the other parent. It all comes down to your agreement and how you work things out. You could have one parent do all the hours. You could have the parents share the hours. You could have one parent do the hours, the parent who works part-time do the hours when they're there. And if the parent who works full-time doesn't want to, or doesn't have the time, or isn't able to do the hours, they can hire an outside provider to do the hours when they're there. It comes down to how you plan things in your agreement. But yes, the short answer is yes. If both parents want to be providers, then both parents can be providers. But IHSS will ask you to fill out a form allocating how many hours each provider gets. And you'll have to file a new form in order to change that. It's not flexible.
We know this is a complicated issue.
It's a
It
complicated issue even without the rule changes.
exactly, and it is quite unique to a lot of families of how it's going to play out. Mikhail, you are up next. Are you able to unmute? Oh, there you go.
Yes, thank you very much. This is such an important topic. Thank you for bringing it to the front. I have two questions, two issues. Because this is a recent change, is it going to need some tracking for parents, single parents, parents of divorce, like just like an equity kind of tracking to see how case managers and TD counselors at regional centers are implementing this new change, because I can see where it's very confusing and parents get the straight information, or may not understand if language material is not provided that's transparent, so you can have inequitable and unequal access. And then my next issue is, it's not relating to IHSS, but to rest out. My son was not able to use rest hours because he did not acquire a companion to go with him and do things with him, and he began to resent having a chaperone. So we didn't use many rest hours. And I was told that we couldn't, as parents, provide for those hours. And then the counselor at our regional center told us that that may be a concern when evaluating for our budget. But I asked them, you never gave us any alternatives for my son, who is doesn't require as much structure or intensive care. That was the only thing that we qualified for.
Mikhail, that is such a great point and such a great question. Now, respite is different than IHSS.
Yes,
And so the respite, a parent cannot be a provider, because the idea is to give the parent a break,
yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes,
So these changes potentially can help in those situations, again, for minors, because parents who before wouldn't qualify to be the provider may now be able to be. an IHSS provider. It won't resolve everybody's issues, but for some people, and I think as Lisa said, there were some cases where people didn't have the ability to be hired by IHSS, and that meant that they couldn't work those hours. Either they didn't pass a background check or they couldn't legally work here. And so those hours were still being deducted from their self-determination, but budget, even though they weren't being accessed. So I think hopefully that I roundabout answered your question there. We have so many questions in chat.
Thank
So we had one which was from Teresa Rosales, and she said, "I'm confused. So if your child qualifies for protection supervision, can you hire a family member, or you have to do it yourself as the parent if if in a one parent home?"
Either one, it's your decision now. Well, I mean, like your family's decision who you want to hire to provide the protective supervision. And it can be a combination of those things. As I mentioned before, obviously you can't provide protective supervision during the hours that you are working because you're busy working. But you can hire a family member or an outside provider to provide those hours while you're working and then provide them hours yourself when you're home. You can make that decision for yourself now because it's no longer prohibited by statute.
We have a second question in chat, which I think kind of falls in line with our prior question, which was Sony asked, "I have an 8-year-old. I homeschool. He has an IEP, currently has protective supervision in full hours. I don't work outside as I'm the caregiver. He has severe separation anxiety and has SDP. We are using respite as well. Will we have any issues if I'm using respite, and will they cut down the IHSS hours?"
So, okay. So with IHSS, the only time that they are going to reduce the hours is if somebody else is providing the care that your child was allocated. So, for example, if you look at your notice of action so I mean, it all breaks down to how many IHSS hours you have and how many respite hours you have. If you have like a massive number of IHSS of respite hours, that might start breaking into it. But most families do not have a massive number of respite hours. So if you look at your notice of action, there are 168 hours in a week. And in most cases, if a child's in school, it's going to say on the notice that it'll say like hours that you're services you're receiving from somebody else. And the number of hours per week that the child is in school is going to be written on that notice of action. But that comes out of the 168 hours a week. That doesn't come out of the 195 hours that you can only get per month for IHSS. And this is one of the really confusing things about notices of action. And we actually have a video at Undivided that I did going over the notice of action line by line and explaining what each thing is. But if it's a smaller number of hours, then it shouldn't impact IHSS. It's usually more when the child is at school and certain services are being provided by somebody else. Because if you're getting like 4 hours of respite in a day, that leaves 20 other hours when you're providing care. So, and parents are not required to like clock in and clock out, clock in and clock out. So that can be kind of fluid. So, as long as you're actually still providing all of those hours, and you're not getting, like 16 hours of respite in a day, you can only bill as many hours as there are. So I don't know if that answers the question. It's just services can't overlap, but there's enough hours in the day to receive all the services. And if you've ever been asked by the regional center to draw out a weekly schedule, you've had to confront exactly how many hours are not being covered by other services. And so it really shouldn't.
Sony wanted to unmute. If we can find her to unmute, so she wanted to clarify her question.
Okay.
I don't know if my team can find her. Were you guys able to find her in the link?
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for helping me. I mean, I didn't know how to raise the hand, so that's why. Thank you so much for the detailed explanation. Yeah. So my child certainly has like a lot of severe needs. I mean, he has a lot of physical challenges, and he's 100% dependent. Along with separation anxiety, and he's nonverbal. So I homeschool him. So even though he's basically schooled, I'm the one who is completely like with him. He's just home all day, all the time, and I'm the one who takes him to therapies and a lot of appointments and everything. So and he also needs the protective supervision and all of that. So currently I'm home, I'm not working. The thing is that even in SDP, they could give not like so many hours like in respite, but I do have like certainly reasonable amount of hours like given for respite and for personal assistance, but I'm unable to find anyone for personal assistance. And even for respite, I could only find one person like very recently, that she's coming like few hours a week. So other than that, it's completely me, and even the schooling and all of those things. So the question is that to even write for SDP requesting for hours, I had to like give them the account of the full hours that are being consumed in IHSS, and on top of that, like why I actually requesting for extra hours. So the question here is that, so if at all I work full time, I'm not working full time now, but my husband works full time. If I work full time, and I see that do we really have to hire someone, or can I say that when I'm working during these hours, so his dad or his sister or someone is basically like with him? I mean, do they really need to be hired, or can it be like another friend or someone who's watching the kid?
Um, for the IHSS hours, or
Yeah, if I want to claim full IHSS hours, but the thing is, I watch him even all night as well. Like as you've mentioned, it's nights are not easy for us too. It's like I'm always available anytime, kind. So I'm watching pretty much like during the day. Like it's just in between here and there is what like I try to like navigate other things around his thing. Um, so in such case, is it possible that, okay, I have a full-time job that I am navigating around his schedule, while I'm like, working for 8 hours, assuming that, the rest of the hours, I'm kind of spreading outside those 8 hours, and those 8 hours, like, it's his dad or his sister, or someone basically like, is just watching him, and with him, that can I claim for like the full IHSS while I'm being a full-time employee?
I mean, the answer to that question is you cannot bill for hours that you are not the one providing the services.
So
So,
if it's the dad,
so, well,
but
so if you are working full time 8 hours a day, and the other 16 hours a day you're providing care to your child,
mhm.
yeah, you can claim all the hours. But if you are working 8 hours a day, and you're not and someone else is providing hours in addition to that, and you're not providing the number of hours per day that you're billing, then no, you can't bill for hours that you're not doing. But if you're providing that number of hours of care, then you can bill for that number of hours,
Oh yeah, I
up,
certainly
up to
am,
the maximum.
without a doubt.
Pardon me?
Yeah, I certainly am the one like providing the
Yeah.
care. So yeah.
So
Where
I think this adds into another question is, if you are working full time, does then you start doing IHSS hours. Is there a limit to how many hours a person can work?
so number one, there cannot be more hours in the day than what you're billing between IHSS and your full-time job. And again, as I said, like 40 hours a week is not what full-time looks like for a lot of people. You have to sleep. Although again, like you are still watching your child that whole time, like you're still responsible for your child, you're still supervising them. Where I foresee it becoming a greater challenge is if your child doesn't have protective supervision, because there's certain services that are offered that you're providing mostly during the day. If you have hours for meals and meal preparation and feeding and tube feeds that, you know, if you feed during the day, and diaper changes and personal other personal care services that are not supervision, you can't do those while you sleep. Those happen during the day, they happen at established times, and it's gonna be hard for you to argue that you're changing your child's diaper the number of times or doing the number of G-tube feeds if you're away during half of them. So that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. But if you are providing, you know, 10 to 12 hours a day of care for your child, especially if they have protective supervision, then yeah. The other scenario where I could foresee that becoming an issue is if your child has protective supervision, but they have so many other services on their notice of action that their hours of protective supervision are actually really small, then it will also be hard for you to argue that you're doing all these other things if you're at work the whole day. So I think you need to look at your notice of action and figure out where all those hours are. Does that make sense? I hope
I think that's where those
Yeah.
charts, the weekly charts, really come in handy. When you're really looking at it and spelling it out and figuring out, and so that makes a lot of sense. Like so there are specified authorized services for in-home support service. And so if your specified service is to be feeding them, you can't put those over overnight hours on your.
Unless your child has G-tube feeds overnight.
Exactly. Or, you know, some of our kiddos are up all night, and you are doing these things. And so, you know, everything I there we can never talk in always, right? There's always a exception to the rule. Kimberly, would you like to unmute?
Yes. So I have a question. Well, kind of two. So question is, was told that they have not put it into effect yet of the form. The county lady came, I told her, I said, hey, I knew about the form, I knew about it. And she's like, oh, we're waiting on it. And I'm like, in my head, who are you waiting for? Like
When was
who?
that? When
Yeah,
was
that was literally, she came in February after it was really, yeah, that's why.
When in February?
February. It was after, yeah, it was February 26th or something like that, after it was fully into effect.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, let me know if you hear something. And I'm like, in my head thinking, I already heard it. It's from your boss. It's
So
from the
send her
department.
send her a copy of this all county letter, or
Okay.
send a message to her and tell her what it's all
It's
county.
fine now, but I just think it's
all county
interesting.
letter 23-106.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Yeah, I have it. I have it in a draft. I just think it's
Yeah.
weird. And on top of that, people don't realize too when it comes to IHSS and minors, I've come to figure it out. You guys are working for your child. So you guys still respite is still gonna be needed. Don't ever forget, my daughter's an SDP, that's why we're here. So you're still gonna need that respite time away from your child, regardless if she's receiving IHSS, because I still need a break from it, even though I'm not serving her IHSS yet, but I still already need a break from her. So just imagine if I was doing it full time and taking on those hours. I'm like, no, I still need a break from my child because it's healthy. It's healthy for the child and it's healthy for the parent to still require that break. Sorry, guys, I'm at work. But thank you. You guys, I love this. Thank you.
It's such a great point, Kimberly. We do. And so, and I do think that people get IHSS and respite confused all the time. And so remember, respite is for you. It's for you to get a break, and you need it. We had a question from Amber Turley, which actually kind of piggybacked on that. Where specifically should we point to in the letter to justify that full-time working parents can now be the providers in the event the case manager isn't well informed?
It's the whole letter. I mean, this is the things that I showed you in this presentation that were in gray are quotes from the letter. This is the sole purpose of this letter. There's no other issue addressed in the letter. This is what this letter is about. So if they get that letter and they're still telling you that you can't be the provider because they haven't put it into place yet, file a hearing request. Like let them get a bunch of hearing requests from counties where the IHSS provider, their caseworkers are not like following the law, right? File a hearing request.
Sometimes they take a nudge. They need a nudge to get
Yeah,
up to date.
this is not at their discretion.
Yeah.
This is state law. And they don't get to decide when they start implementing it.
Another, if you are stuck and they are not doing it, you can contact Disability Rights California, and they can help sometimes get that nudge going. So, Mary, would you like to unmute?
Mary Catherine?
Oh, there you go.
Hi, everyone. I have a question. I'm not sure if it might be related, but I'm not sure. I got here a little late. My son is an adult and he receives protector supervision. In my household, I am the IHS provider. So, and my husband is the parent who works as required by IHSS. What happens when the parent who works is ready to retire, but he can't take care of my son who, due to health issues. So what will happen in case when my husband wants to retire?
So first of all, you said your son is an adult?
Correct.
So even before this change, none of these rules apply to parent providers for adults. These restrictions for full-time and part-time work, and what I was saying in the presentation in the slideshow is that these restrictions no longer apply. They have been eliminated, they have been removed, but they also never applied to parent providers for adults. They were only ever applied to children where the parent has a legal obligation to care for the child because they're a minor and it's the parent. And so in that case, that's when those work restrictions were imposed. So if you were told when your son was an adult, if you were told that one of you has to be working full time, that's not correct. It was never correct.
Okay.
So retire when you need to retire. None of that is in effect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your feedback.
So we have a question from Amalia Contreras at, oh, hold on one second. I'm reading the wrong one. From Marisol Galicia at 5:30. She said, I work 6 hours per day.
Mhm.
My husband is my daughter's provider from 9 to 5. After 5 p.m., I take care of my daughter. She has epilepsy. Can I still apply as her provider? The regional center said I cannot apply because of my immigration status.
Okay, if you were ineligible to provide hours before this change because of your immigration status, then you are still ineligible to provide hours now because of the same immigration status. But the other thing that I would say is that even if you were able to be hired as a provider, if you take over some of the hours when you get home, that means that if your husband was claiming overtime, he would no longer be getting overtime hours because you would then be taking hours at the regular IHSS rate. And so to the extent that one parent is providing most of the hours and the other parent is not, except under like special circumstances, it's gonna wind up cutting the total amount that you get because you lose the overtime if the other parent takes over after 8 hours. So just, I would keep that in mind regardless of immigration status, but the rules regarding who is eligible to be hired by IHSS have not changed with respect to immigration status, with respect to conviction history, depending on what the conviction is. Those have not changed.
This second question was from Amalia Contreras at 5:23. Are there any changes when they are of legal age? Does IHSS have she has supervised supervision, but we think maybe the interpretation would be protected supervision.
It's protective supervision. Protective supervision is the term, and it gets confusing because then the regional center also has specialized supervision, which is daycare, and so there's a lot of terms that are being thrown around that overlap, and it gets really confusing. For IHSS, protective supervision is a clump of hours that is assigned when a person needs 24/7 supervision to prevent themselves from accidentally hurting themselves because of their cognitive impairments, impairments of judgment, memory, and orientation. That's protective supervision. So there are some additional hours that become available when a person turns 18 that you don't get for children, such as going grocery shopping, or doing like yard work or there's other things that they say, well, parents are supposed to do that for their children anyway. And I think like laundry is up there until like they're 14 or 15. I'm like, don't tell the kids that. Like they're very it's a stretch, some of those, when they say, oh, the parent is expected to provide up to a certain age, but once they turn 18, there's no longer those limitations on other services that people can get through IHSS. But that is a matter of assessment for IHSS. That is not a question about whether the parent can provide those hours.
Yeah, so there were kind of two questions in that question. Cindy, do you want to unmute?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I was just asking another question, so I don't know if I can ask both together. First question is, if I am working full time and my husband's currently, if we split the hours between him and me for some reason, we live together, are we both living providers that our income, IHS's income is exempt from tax? Or is it only for one living provider can claim the tax exemption? That's the first question. And then the second question was around, I remember there were some like other parents were asking about 8-year-olds and age limit, like care. So if my 12-year-old, needs help, like what is the level of parental care for like a 12-year-old? Like most 12-year-olds, like they can eat when they're hungry if there's meals prepared for them, but maybe you need to cook for them. But like my 12-year-old, for instance, needs to be prompted and reminded that she needs to eat, right? Like otherwise she won't eat and she'll pass out. Or like she needs to wash her hair, hygiene, like she'll wash it herself if you prompt her. So I guess that's my question is like, can you get the hygiene care for a 12-year-old in that circumstance? Or is it like you physically have to do it for them?
So I am going to answer those questions in order. It's fine. It's two questions. One of the answers is really easy, is yes. You're a live-in provider if you're a live-in provider. There's not like, if you live with both your parents, then both of your parents don't pay taxes on the income. But again, if one parent is accustomed to providing most of the hours, you're going to lose that overtime if you split the hours between you. If you
No.
you do have overtime.
Yeah, oh, I don't actually understand overtime, because
So overtime is more than 40 hours a week.
but they don't let us log more than 40 hours a week.
Okay, well, but if you don't have more than 40 hours a week in IHSS hours, then you won't be able to. But some people have 283 hours per month. That's the max hours. And that averages out to about around 65 or 66 hours a week. And a person who has one consumer is able to bill up to that amount if they're living with the provider and providing those services. And so anything over 40 hours a week, and that's also, by the way, in case you didn't know, that's also including the Career Pathways program. So if you are doing career pathways classes, you will get overtime rates if you're doing hours past 40 hours a week. And
but I have 264.
So then yes, they should be permitting you to bill over 40 hours a week. In that case, the max hours, okay, that's a whole other problem.
The app physically limit us from, like, we have 264 hours, so the only thing we can do is just only log. I don't remember what we do.
Okay,
but it physically limits us from logging more than 40 hours a
Okay,
week. Like
something's
the
wrong
app
in the
won't let us do it.
something is wrong in the portal, because your max hours is
Yeah.
your average hours a week is your total number of hours divided by 4.33, and your max hours is total number of hours
Okay.
divided by 4. And if it's not letting you log more than that in the portal, then that's a problem that needs to be resolved, because you should be getting overtime for that.
Okay, I'll double check the portal. Thank you so much.
So over 40 hours a week is overtime. It means time and a half, which you will lose if you split hours. Okay, second question. I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is the functional index ranking for minors. This gives you an idea of, and let me just bring it up again. I'm not going to share my screen again because I don't want to like break something like I did last time when I shared the screen. But the bottom line is, are you able to open that link?
Yeah, I see it. Yes.
So
Thank
if
you.
anywhere you see a 1, that is where parents are typically expected to provide that service to a minor anyway, regardless of disability. Anywhere you see a 1 or 6, that means either it's the parent should be doing it anyway, or it's a paramedical service. So for example, for an infant, for a 6-month-old baby, bowel and bladder care is either a 1, either parents are changing diapers anyway, or the baby has an ostomy or something, or has to be catheterized. For feeding, either the parent is expected to feed the baby or the baby has a feeding tube. So and anywhere you see 1 to 5, that ranking of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 is going to depend on how much help the child needs in order to complete that task. Whether they just need reminders, whether they need sort of a little bit of physical help, whether they need hand-over-hand assistance, or whether they're completely dependent. And the number of minutes that you get for that task, it's going to depend on how much assistance the child needs with that task. Does that make sense? So this
Yes, that totally makes sense.
So the functional index, there are documents. I don't have it on hand, but because I see somebody asked about a functional index for those over 18. There are indexes that show what the rankings of 1 to 5 mean and how many minutes it is for each task. But the whole point of the functional index is what parents are expected to do for a child of the same age who doesn't have that same disability. That's not an issue with adults, because parents are not expected to provide those services to somebody who's 18, because they're supposed to be able to provide those services for themselves.
Yeah, so this is super helpful because I mean, my 12-year-old does have personal assistant during after school for some of these things, but like these personal assistants can't stay at night sometimes when she actually showers or has to shower. Like last night, I had to remind her 4 times to shower, and then we had to shut off, all our electronics, and then we have to like wait outside to make sure she showers, and then go to sleep so she can get up for like schoolwork. And so that's IHSS work that I have been doing, that I have not been, billing because or also work full time. So this law is really great. I mean, like I have multiple children who should have IHSS. So I did not have IHSS for the older one because she's higher functioning. We have IHSS protective services for the younger one. But if we have multiple children and there's no way for one parent to do maximum for multiple children because there's more, so this is really helpful now that both parents can, even if I am working full time, can do it.
And just so you know, because I mentioned it before, if there are certain services that are provided during the day, they're going to deduct that on the notice of action if they're provided by somebody else. So that will be deducted. It'll show up on the notice of action as these are the number of this is the amount of hours you need. These are the services that are being provided by somebody else. So these are the hours that we're awarding to pay.
Yeah, I understand they can't overlap it, but like realistically, trying to get someone that the family trusts for a 12-year-old girl who's going through puberty, and there's concerns about that, like like 9 to 11, 9 to midnight, like that does, and then family has privacy issues, other family, like there's sometimes you just can't get help, you know what I mean? Like you may have the funds, like there's
Yeah.
the rest of the family to consider.
Right.
And I
And
think that's a great point that you brought up is that, you know, because they're opening this up for, and especially with siblings and all that, that parents can do more of those because it is so hard to find somebody outside. So I think that this is going to be beneficial. You know, these rules are going to make it easier for those hours to be covered
and I want to
going
I
outside.
want to add that if you have 2 consumers or more, then your max hours a week is 66, period. It's a little bit higher if you only have 1 consumer. But if you have 2 or more consumers, you can only work 66 hours a week, but that means the other parent could take some of those hours too. I mean, I would also just add that you know, this is a bigger conversation, but you know, you can apply for a child for IHSS who you perceive as being able to do certain things if what they're not able to do is within the scope of what IHSS covers. Because, you know, a child's functioning is like a whole loaded conversation, but like if
Yeah.
a kid has to be reminded and reminded and reminded to do things like brush their teeth and go to the bathroom and feed themselves and take a shower, those are ADLs. And those are things
They
that
are. They have
covers.
to be reminded to drink water. Like she
Yeah.
literally got heat stroke.
So, and sometimes the caseworkers don't understand that. They'll talk to a child, and if they know their name, they'll be like, "Oh, you're self-directing. Oh, you don't need this service or this service or this service."
Oh yeah, talk to a child who has ASD trying to mask her disability and has
Right.
social anxiety, and you ask her, like, do you need help showering? A 12-year-old. Do you think they're gonna say yes?
Right. Right. So that's a whole other conversation, and it's a challenge, but I'm glad you're cognizant of it so that you can bring it up if it comes up.
But this
But
is super helpful
So,
because I
so
think we didn't really
thank
pursue
you.
the
We,
second one.
we do need to get moving to our next question. Mario, oh my gosh, Mariora? Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. I don't know if we can talk about adult individuals with IHSS.
Of course, go ahead.
Oh, so what are the rules? Because I have been the live-in provider while my daughter lived at home. She did have protective supervision, and now she transitioned to her own SLS-ILS setting. And when I reported the address change and that I no longer will be providing the protective supervision and overall, I did not want to be the provider for her any longer. They stopped altogether all the hours. HRC is making me report or actually reinstate the case or appeal the decision to reinstate the IHSS hours. Why would I want to do that when she is receiving direct support? She's entitled to 24/7 direct support care at a much higher pay rate than what IHSS is.
they're asking you to reinstate IHSS. So tell me where is she living again?
She's living in Rancho PB.
But not like the city, but like what kind of
It's an SLS settings. It's a supported living setting or independent living setting. So she's in her own home,
right.
separate from me.
Right, but there's already services there that are providing all of these services.
There are services, yes.
Then IHSS, even if IHSS assessed, they would not give the hours because they would say somebody else is already providing all these services.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know, how to handle the next step where I need to meet and they need to reevaluate the situation.
I mean, that would be my initial, I mean, I would have to read up on like, because there's certain types of facilities where if you live in that facility, you can't get IHSS because you're no longer living in your own home, but it doesn't sound like it's that kind of situation.
It is a private residence.
Right. But if those services are already being provided, then IHSS is like, it'll assess for the number of hours, but then they'll say, number of hours you receive from somebody else, like all of them.
This is Judy. If I could try to answer this, Mariara. So because the regional center is the payer of last resort, what is likely to happen is that you will get reassessed for if you're, I don't know if your child needs 24/7 supports, but if they do, then your child will continue to receive the maximum amount of hours that IHSS provides. And when you're looking at what the regional center is going to provide, they're going to subtract the 283 hours per month, and then they'll be supporting through supported living all of those remaining hours, or through the SDP if you're in the SDP.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that, because I work predominantly with children. And so they're not living independently. And so I'm a little bit more fuzzy on how they split all the hours when you're dealing with adults.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you jumping in.
But I would love to give a recommendation in this area for adults, because my son is about to move out. And so we're facing this exact situation. And so 283 hours is about 9 hours a day. However, those 9 hours do not have to be direct support hours. So as my son is moving out, I'm going to maintain about 1 hour a day, even though I don't live with him, to do other things besides direct care, such as set up his doctor's appointments, do his grocery shopping for him, manage his staff. Those are all protective supervision or other kinds of things. So as you're negotiating the number of hours that you should be getting from the regional center, you should not say, the 24 hours a day minus the 9 hours. We've been able to negotiate 24 hours a day minus 8 hours, because we feel like 1 hour a day is support being provided to him that is not direct support, not direct care. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Not quite.
Okay. So if you get the full amount of IHSS hours, that is considered the generic resource for regional centers. Regional centers make you get funding from other sources first. So IHSS is one of those generic resources. If you get the full amount of hours, that comes to about 9 hours a day.
Right.
But the way that IHSS works is it's not all of those 9 hours per day are direct care for the individual. It's not like directly helping them, driving them, helping them with toileting, showering, hygiene. Not all of those hours need to be for direct care. Some of those hours can be for things like making doctor's appointments, going to the grocery store. These are not things that the person being served is part of. They're not there standing next to you as you're doing that, but these are things that still have to get done and can be used with IHSS hours. So my point is,
my question is, what do I communicate to the IHSS caseworker? Do I keep the whole amount?
The same. Yes, you will be getting the same amount. The thing is that the providers may in fact be different providers. And if you do some of these things like grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, you should hold on to some of those hours. We've held on to about 1 hour a day to do other kinds of things for our son. And then everything else will be paid for by what will be IHSS workers who are directly working with my son in the moment.
How many hours do you predict of having IHSS allocated to the direct support?
About 8 hours per day.
Okay, so
because that's the maximum. I don't know if your child gets the maximum number of hours, but the maximum number of hours is 283 hours per month, which comes in average about 9 hours per day. And so about 8 hours of those are providing direct support at minimum wage. So it's obviously harder to find IHSS workers. And so another argument you can make to your regional center is that we could not find anybody to take IHSS hours because the rate is so low. And therefore, we're only able to have someone 2 nights a week or 3 nights a week at those hours, and you can say to the regional center, you have to fill those other hours with adding money to the SDP budget while you're trying to find someone who's willing to take minimum wage. And
They
you can
did work with
definitely-
me. It was beautiful. Yes, they did work with me while she was without IHSS hours. They compensated through the SDP budget many months while we resolved this.
Great.
We resolved
I
this.
hope that
Thanks
helps.
so much. Thank you.
A really common question we get, Judy, is can IHSS be reduced because of SLS hours? And so we keep trying to explain to people, IHSS should never be reduced because they're the generic resource. They would be, but it could impact the number of SLS hours you get on the regional center side. And that can change if you move from living with a family member and then moving out into your own residence. So because SLS services will, they're different than independent living skills services. So so your hours might change a bit when they change where they're living.
But let me also say that you are not legally obligated to tell the regional center how many IHSS hours you are getting. So as they are calculating supports that they are providing to you, you do not have to tell them. Now, that's the way it is today. That could change in the future where you will be required to show what you get from IHSS. But today, I know many parents who say, I'm not going to tell you. And because they don't trust the regional center and they see the regional center as using those hours to deny your child services. So it's really how you want to do it. So I tell my regional center how many hours we get, but I cannot tell other people what to do.
Judy, so you got a compliment in the chat. They said, who's Judy? She's so smart. Judy is
How
our
do you know?
president.
Yes, she is. And thank you so much for stepping in because, like I said, I focus mostly on kids and I would hate to be giving the wrong information. So thank you for jumping in on that.
So we have 2 minutes left. So GR, I'm going to give, if it's a quick question, I'm going to let you ask quick question, last one, and before we close up. GR, are you able to unmute?
Oh, hi there. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting this. This is so helpful. My question is, if I were to transition to full-time employment from part-time, do I have to let my social worker know, or do I just wait until the next reassessment? And then the second question that I have was, during our reassessment, I feel like my son has hours in some other areas, but then our social worker said, well, you're getting the max already, so it doesn't really matter. So we never got to update or accurately, put in the right hours in some of the categories, but I let it go. But is it smart to go back and ask, can we just update them regardless whether, it's the max is max, but, would you advise me to go back to the social worker just to accurately depict where my son stands in the chart?
Yeah. Okay. So your first question is, it no longer matters to IHSS what your work schedule is, because these requirements have been lifted. As far as max hours, I would say absolutely. You want to make sure that all all unmet need is documented. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is you want the notice of action to accurately reflect your child's needs. Number two is that there have been situations in the past where the state has tried to cut IHSS services, and there was an across the board cut years ago. And in some of the iterations of the state's efforts to cut hours, it specifically said that hours would be cut first from unmet need. and second from existing hours. And so if you have unmet need documented, then if that happens again, and if the way that they approach it again is to deduct hours first from unmet need, you want that documented. Another reason, I'm sure there are multiple reasons, but another reason is that if your child eventually winds up on the HCBA waiver, and this is specifically for people who meet the criteria to be admitted into a skilled nursing facility, or acute or subacute hospital facility, there may be additional hours available. There's a waiting list for that waiver now, but it fluctuates. And it's the only waiver, to my knowledge, that allows a home nursing, private duty nursing, once the child is no longer an EPSDT. So once they are an adult, there may be opportunities for additional hours called waiver personal care services hours. And in that case, it's very helpful to be able to show that you have maxed out IHSS and that there's additional unmet need. And the other reason, if I can just jump in, sorry, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but the other reason is that when the regional center keeps trying to cut all those hours, or trying to say you have these hours that meet all your needs, you can point to the notice of action that says you have 56 unmet need hours per month and be like, no, IHSS is not meeting all my needs. I want to say real quickly that a few people have asked if I can drop the way that they do the function, the index, how they do tasks for adults. If I can drop that into the chat. And so I did that. So
Thank you so much. Thank you to our interpreters who work so hard. We have to finish on time because our interpreters, we have to let them out. Lisa, you are amazing. Thank you so much. You are getting so much love in the chat. If people want to find more information about Undivided, they do at Facebook. How is it monthly?
We do Facebook Lives, we do office hours.
Yes.
You can do consults with individual specialists. We do focus on children. So just so you know.
So you know where to find Lisa if you need to find her. Thank you all so much, and we will see you back at Connect in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.